Hey, thank you for coming. I'm Mark Raimondi. Just want to say that this is going to be an interactive, which doesn't look like it'll be
Please
difficult.
move up.
So we'd like to make this very interactive. This is a foundational year for focusing on some of the geopolitical aspects of what's going on in the world that might impact investments. Dmitri is the founder of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is a national security think tank looking at geopolitics, trade policy, energy, environmental security, as well as cybersecurity. He's also the co-founder of CrowdStrike, which is one of the largest cybersecurity firms in the world. So again, this is meant to be interactive, and so we look forward to your participation. Dmitri.
Thanks so much, Mark. So please try to move up. I'm happy to take questions. So we'll talk about a few things. We'll talk a little bit about the war, Russia-Ukraine war, and its impact on the economy, its impact on global trade and energy. And then we'll talk about the implications of this on China-Taiwan scenarios for potential conflict in that region. So first, the war. So if you're paying attention, there's been quite significant developments that took place over last week with a significant Ukrainian counteroffensive that I think surprised a lot of people, including the success of the counteroffensive. I think surprised even the Ukrainians in terms of how the Russian military crumbled in the north. Now, I want to be very clear that that does not mean that Russian military is going to crumble everywhere. One of the reasons for the very rapid progress, and at last count, the Ukrainians have now taken over 6,000 square miles of territory in this latest offensive since it began mid last week. But one of the reasons they've been so successful is that the Russians pulled a lot of their major forces down south to the Kherson area, where there's another major counteroffensive going on that's been taking place for the last few weeks and actually has not been very successful yet. And the Ukrainians have encountered a lot of resistance and taken a lot of casualties on that front. So this is not an indication that the Russian military is collapsing. It is an isolated region where Ukrainians were facing mostly Russian irregulars, not their professional military cadre. It was mostly people that were conscripted from the Luhansk National Republic, the LNR as it's called, as well as the Rosgvardia folks, which is basically interior forces. Sort of the way I describe it is cops with tanks. These are militarized police, but not necessarily people that you would expect to be engaged in a major defensive activities. And as a result, on many fronts, they just collapsed. They ran away, some before even the engagement. But those are not the forces that Russia has elsewhere in the conflict. The conflict, of course, is going on now for 7 months. Frankly, I don't see it ending anytime soon. I think President Putin, until at least a few days ago, still believed that he was winning this conflict. It's not clear if he has readjusted his expectations just yet, but the reality is that even if he is starting to have some doubts, this is going to take him a while to come to terms that one of the greatest militaries on the planet, as he was thinking, is encountered a significant defeat against what he thought was a ragtag army of Ukrainians. Nevertheless, he still has a number of things going for him, and it's important to understand that. While the Ukrainians are having significant success on the battlefield from a military perspective, they've been able to, of course, defend their government, defend their capital since the Russians pulled back from Kiev in April. They've been able to launch this major counteroffensive and take quite a bit of their territory that they had lost since February 24th. But yet, their economy is in a state of collapse. Their GDP is contracted by 45%. It has been mostly an export-driven economy pre-war. Over 50% of their economic activity was due to exports of agricultural products, metals, and other resources that they're extracting from the ground, and various industrial goods. Virtually all of that is shut down. There's a little bit of exports taking place through rail lines that are going into Poland, but you cannot compensate for the major shipping activity that was taking place on the Black Sea in the ports of Odessa, Mariupol, which is now taken by Russia, Port of Kherson, Port of Mykolaiv, which are all blockaded by Russia. So until the blockade is lifted, and Russia is in full control of when they lift that blockade, you really will not have a significant recovery of the Ukraine economy. And there's no prospect of that until President Putin decides to lift it, probably in exchange for something in return, almost certainly. The other major thing to realize is that Putin still has a card to play, and that is energy blackmail. Both energy blackmail in Europe, where he's using gas supplies to Europe, of course, cutting off gas supplies through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, which was supplying the majority of the gas to the European Union, and will almost certainly cause a major recession in Europe later this winter. But he's also cutting off electricity to Ukraine. He's doing that in a number of ways. He has just shut down the nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, where you may have heard in the news there's a lot of military activity taking place in the last couple of months. A lot of shelling, which is not something you want to have near a nuclear power plant. And as a result of that activity, they basically shut down the nuclear reactor, which was supplying considerable percentage of electricity to Ukraine pre-war, about 35%. So very, very significant. And then just in the last 2 days, the Russians have been launching missile strikes against a variety of other power stations in northern and eastern Ukraine, taking large portions of the territory offline temporarily. The Ukrainians have been able to bring it back up, but we'll see if they can continue to keep those operational while the missile strikes are taking place. So there's clear strategy here to try to starve Ukraine of energy, and Europe as well, but primarily Ukraine, leading into the winter that if it's cold winter, will create pretty dire conditions for a lot of civilians in that country. So that is his strategy. I think he's going to try to see how it plays out, at least through early winter, to determine whether it makes sense to pursue larger goals and to try to keep the military effort going or not. So I don't see a rapid resolution here until at least he determines whether he is succeeding or not. And then he has options. So people that think that his regime is in power, I think, are quite mistaken. The reality is that his hold on power in Moscow has never been stronger. He has eliminated virtually all opposition. And with the draconian laws that the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament, has passed since the start of the war, he has eliminated a lot of the opposition that you would even see to the war in the streets and in newspapers, because people can now go to jail for a considerable amount of time for opposing this military action. So I think he's still fairly secure in his power, because this war is not existential for Russia, because this is a war of choice, he can afford to lose it, and controlling much of the media in Russia, he can even spin it as accomplishing his ultimately misguided and terrible war, accomplishing the objectives of that operation by saying that he's demilitarized Ukraine by destroying much of it, and he can now pull out. And again, remember, the blockade is still the chip that he has that he can trade for significant gains from the Ukrainians. Remains to be seen what the Ukrainians would be willing to do in return, but with their economy in a state of collapse, with so many refugees out of the country, with their inability to keep up with the salaries for government workers, even for military personnel, this is going to be a pretty dire situation for them for years to come, unless they can lift the blockade, unless they can resume some economic activity, and Putin ultimately holds the keys to that. So let's talk about China for a second, switching gears. And by the way, if you have questions, please, I can't really see anyone in the room because of the lights, but Mark here is running around with a mic, or is happy to, so feel free to engage. And Mark, please, if you see folks, great.
Do we need this, actually? Yeah, thank you for, my name is An Porisi, and I'm from Morgan Stanley, and thank you for taking my question. Mm-hmm. Before you move on to China and Taiwan, if I may ask, with regard to Russia and Ukraine, I know we kind of talk about, this coming winter, but it seems that this situation, this conflict, is going to prolong for a little bit longer. How is Europe going to prepare beyond the winter, and what happens then, or what if the situation where Russia continues to blackmail not only energy, but also you're talking about soft commodities, all of that. And we're looking at the global environment when we've got the pandemic, and then you've got food shortages, and you're talking about environmental issues, so on and so forth. And you heard about today with inflation being where it is, the anticipation is not only the political aspect, but also the economical aspect of it, if I may ask.
That's a great question. And you bring up an excellent point, because a lot of the conversation with regards to Russia is often about their energy supplies, oil and gas. But you're absolutely right. They supply enormous amounts of raw material in the world, titanium that is used by Boeing and others to build our planes, right? Nickel, aluminum, neon gas, a lot of things that we actually need in our industrial production. They have actually not used that weapon just yet in curtailing those supplies, but they certainly can do that. And if things exacerbate further, I would expect that they would look at that very, very carefully. And by the way, if you read the New York Times this morning, it talked about the successful counteroffensive on the Ukrainian side, and how the U.S. was intimately involved in helping to review those plans and even adjust them and provide feedback to the Ukrainians. So we're now very actively in this fight beyond just supplies of weapons. And I'm actually astonished that administration officials would talk about this openly on the record, because this is certainly not going to be received well in Moscow. And again, they have ways to retaliate in various economic ways, like what I've just mentioned. With regards to Europe, Europe is not going to collapse, right? Gas they're receiving now from other sources, LNG from Qatar. They're building up more LNG terminals, trying to buy more from the U.S. as well. But it's going to be really, really tough for them. They're not going to freeze because they're going to prioritize shutting down industrial production before it impacts residential, particularly in Germany. And by the way, Europe is really not a monolith. Not every country is going to have dire situations. Some in the south, like Spain, for example, actually have good supplies from North Africa and elsewhere. So we're primarily talking about Germany and some of the Eastern European states that are going to be in real trouble. France is not in great shape because it just so happened that half of their reactors have been shut down due to maintenance issues. So they've got some tight reserves, but not as bad as Germany. But in Germany, we already have a situation where a number of industrial plants are shutting down, and I think you'll see a lot more of that, obviously impacting severely their economic production and rising unemployment. So they'll make through it, but it won't be pretty in terms of economic output, and will have lasting implications as well. But on the other hand, there's nothing like high prices to fix high prices, because it is compressing demand, and we're actually starting to see gas prices going down as a result of the fact that people are predicting a very, very severe recession in Europe. Any other questions on Russia? Yeah. Oh, is that Biana? Yeah. Oh, hi. Good to see you. Okay.
Hi there. What do you think at this point the most realistic peace settlement could look like between Russia and Ukraine, in your sense? And also, is there enough food? Like, I've seen some predictions of kind of severe food uncertainty in Africa as a result of this, and but I also, there's been opinions that there's enough food to feed all the people, and to what extent do you think there's a risk of a major famine there?
So on my podcast, Geopolitics of Canada, I actually did a deep dive episode on the food issue. There is no food shortage. There is plenty of grain. There's plenty of wheat substitutes, like rice, for example. If you just look at corn, we throw 40% of our corn away on ethanol. Not throw it away, but use it for ethanol production. So there's plenty of food to go around. The issue is one of logistics and price. And food prices have actually been going up even before the war due to stockpiling primarily by China. And since the war, just like energy prices, you've seen speculation driving higher prices. So what you have here is a real problem with regards to food availability in some of these poor countries, but not because there's not enough food, but because they can't afford it. And Putin has actually made a legitimate case when he opened up some transport out of Odessa of wheat supplies with the deal that he had made with Turkey about a month ago, the goal was to alleviate the food pressure on Africa. And he just recently, in the last week, said, well, we thought it would help Africa, but all those ships are actually not going to Africa. They're going to Ireland. They're going to other places in Europe. He's actually right, because the ships are going where the buyers are that are willing to pay the high price, and that's not in Africa. So he's already threatening to potentially cut that off, saying, well, this is not what we agreed upon. But that will sort itself out, because there's plenty of supplies available, and ultimately, just like with gas prices, I think you're going to see a drop in food prices once people realize that there's actually quite a bit of availability. And the stockpiling starts to slow down. You know, India, for example, stopped their exports because of panic. I think some of those attitudes will shift as time goes on.
Okay. Can we get to
let's do one more question.
One more, and then
yeah.
All right. After this, we'll get to the China-Taiwan, and then we'll hold the questions until after that.
Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this topic. Good to see you, Dmitri.
Likewise.
Why do you think we haven't seen more larger-scale cyber attacks on the part of the Russians? Obviously, there's been help from the West going into this. We've known that. But obviously, Russia also
Cyber
has
attacks
wherewithal.
on Ukraine?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there's been a lot, actually. So I think it's important to understand that just because we're not seeing people talk about it doesn't mean it's not happening. And the Ukrainian operational security has just been incredible. We hear about very little about what's going on their side unless they choose to reveal it to us. And when it comes to cyber, they've been fairly close hold. But there have been a lot of activity. There have been a lot of intrusions. There have been a lot of destructive attacks that the Russians have launched. None of them have had strategic impact, because at the end of the day, there's only so much that cyber matters when you've got, you know, kinetic attacks on power, on malls, on schools and the like. So that obviously is going to attract all the attention, and people are going to care a lot less that their computer doesn't work when they don't have power, when their loved ones are getting killed or maimed. So I think that's one element of it. The most successful cyber attack that we've ever seen from a strategic context actually did occur in this war. It just wasn't in Ukraine. It was an American company called Viasat that was providing satellite communications to Ukraine. And we now know from the Ukrainians reporting this that it had devastating effect on the ability of the Ukrainian military to communicate in the crucial first hours and days of the war. It literally blinded them and forced them to rely on runners to get to their units when they were defending Kyiv. So it did have an effect. Of course, the Russians ultimately weren't able to use this incredible coup of being able to shut down enemies' communication and take Kyiv, but that was a problem of a different kind, not necessarily cyber. So, you know, we've got about 10 minutes left, so let me turn to Taiwan and China for a second. So I'm convinced, and by the way, I was very public in predicting that Putin would invade Ukraine back in mid-December of last year for a variety of different reasons, and I believe that President Xi of China is intent on taking back Taiwan by force or otherwise. Not necessarily in the next couple of years. I think the Chinese are not ready to do so militarily, and certainly there's no prospect of taking it peacefully in the foreseeable future either. But in the next 10 years is probably the window for them to execute it. Why the next 10 years? Well, in the 2030s, you're going to see some of the impact of the U.S. military buildup and some of our allies making it significantly more difficult for the Chinese to execute these operations. So, for example, the recently announced AUKUS Accord between U.S., Australia, and the U.K. to provide nuclear-powered submarines to Australia is very important to provide distance and longevity to Australian Navy operating in the region. However, those subs will not get delivered until probably mid-2030s at the earliest. A lot of activity happening in Taiwan to build up indigenous missile productions, which is going to be very critical in sinking the Chinese fleet that's coming across the Taiwan Straits. They're trying to reform their military, doing so very slowly, but nevertheless, you know, if you look at 10 years from now, you may have a very different military that the Chinese would face if they were to invade the island. So things become very, very difficult for them if they wait too long. They can't do it now because they don't have the naval transport capacity. They don't have some of the infrastructure that they need to deter the US. And on the traditional economic side, they're also not independent enough to survive the types of sanctions that they would expect to face, similar to Russia, if they were to invade Taiwan. And I do believe that they will face those sanctions, particularly if this is a conflict that is going to last a while and is going to get very bloody. So, there are different contingencies, of course, but if you have Taiwan being taken over without firing a shot, that's a very different outcome, and probably one that is incredibly favorable to China in terms of sanctions impact and decoupling from the global economy than a conflict where they get bogged down on the beaches or in the ports, and there's a guerrilla fight in the cities and a lot of destruction of infrastructure and starvation because Taiwan imports most of its food and energy. In that type of situation, no matter what the economic impacts are, you're going to have emotions driving the policy agenda, similar to what we've seen in Ukraine, and you're going to have severe sanctions lobbed against China. And one of those that they're very afraid of, we know because of their own statements, is semiconductors. So China today is heavily reliant on import of semiconductors and on chips on Taiwan and the rest of the world. They have fairly limited domestic production, and this has been one of their strategic plans, President Xi's strategic plan since he came into office in 2012. They've invested hundreds of billions of dollars into production of semiconductors, but have achieved very little. This is the one area where, despite of massive industrial theft, despite massive investments, they're actually further behind in terms of advanced capability today than they were even back then, just because technology has moved so rapidly since then. They're still trying to catch up. They're not stopping, of course, and their goal, I believe, is to have independent means of production before they launch an invasion. Original plan was 2025. That does not look realistic now, in part because of export control measures that the U.S. has now taken to try to block equipment that is manufactured mostly by Western countries. Companies in the U.S., Japan, Netherlands, and Germany are the main producers of semiconductor manufacturing equipment. That is some of the most advanced machines man has ever made. And China has none of their indigenous machines working just yet. So we'll see if they'll actually be able to get it working in the foreseeable future. But this is key to them because semiconductors are often called the new oil because so much of our economy runs on them. I actually believe that's misleading because oil has alternatives. There is no alternatives for chips. You can't produce modern weapon systems. You can't produce cars. You can't produce microwaves. You can't produce any modern electronic technology. And as a result, China, that is such a big industrial power, is going to be incredibly challenged economically should there be a blockade of chips, similar to what we're now seeing in Russia, by the way. Even though Russia is not a major industrial power, the export control on semiconductor import into Russia is almost certainly the most impactful sanction that has been implemented against that country since the invasion. It wasn't the financial sanctions, it wasn't even the voluntary pullout of companies, it really was the blockade of semiconductors. The Chinese are watching it very carefully, and they know that in the case of invasion of Taiwan, they can't necessarily rely on taking over the fabs, manufacturing facilities in Taiwan, because very likely they would get destroyed in a conflict, either through just normal airstrike activity and the like, impacting power supplies to those fabs, which would destroy some of this very sensitive equipment, or they could get blown up by U.S. cruise missiles, or Taiwanese could even wire the fabs to be blown up before the Chinese take them over. So it would be highly risky to assume that you could just take over the Taiwanese production capacity as you invade, and if they don't have domestic capacity, they're at enormous, I believe, almost existential risk to their economic future. So they really need to solve that problem before they move on Taiwan. But why would they move on Taiwan? Well, there's obviously a nationalistic reason, there's a patriotic reason, historical reasons of reuniting China. All of that is incredibly important to the Chinese psyche, and at this point, they've sort of gone all in on this with a Chinese population that one day there's going to be a reunification, so it's almost impossible to step back from that. But there's also a hardcore geopolitical reason. China obviously has in its mission the idea of becoming a great superpower, perhaps the only superpower displacing the United States, they cannot achieve that mission without Taiwan. The reason for that is that if you look at the geography of that region, China is completely contained today by the US Navy. All of their trade routes are controlled by US Navy or navies of our allies because of the so-called First Island chain that surrounds the coast of China from the South China Sea all the way to the East China Sea. Taiwan is one of the biggest, or the biggest islands in that chain. Unless you break through that First Island chain, unless you take Taiwan, which has been called the unsinkable aircraft carrier by General MacArthur all the way back in the 1930s, you cannot project power in the Pacific. You cannot stop the US Navy from shutting down your trade routes on a whim. And that is why I believe the Chinese think that they have to have Taiwan, even if they manage to step back from some of their nationalistic rhetoric on the issue, purely from hard, cold geopolitical concerns. And that's the window. They have about 10 years to do it before things can get a lot more complicated for them. And if Taiwan shapes up, they can really make this impossible for China, because if you think about it, it's an island of 23 million people, right? Ukraine was a country of 40 million people, so just about half of Ukraine's size on a much smaller, of course, land size. But 23 million people, if you just conscript and train 10% of that population, which is very reasonable in a wartime situation, or leading up to potential war, that is 2.3 million people. That is about the size of the entire Chinese military. If you actually look at military-age males, to say nothing of the females, that's about 6.5 million people that you can put under arms. If the Chinese actually do that, if they train those people, they will make the invasion a complete impossibility. They're not doing that today. Their military is quite weak, and the choice that they have to make is, do they want to be Ukraine in 2022, standing up to Russia and preventing a takeover of their country, or do they want to be Ukraine in 2014 when Russia took Crimea, took several regions of Ukraine almost without firing a shot? And today they're much closer to 2014 than they are to 2022. But the point, this is an economic conference, a financial conference, the point is that should there be a conflict in the coming decade over Taiwan, what has happened today with regards to Russia and the economic impact that we're seeing that is probably going to cause a global recession is going to look like child's play compared to decoupling, rapid decoupling that we're going to see from China. And I do believe it will happen simply in terms of decoupling in the case of war, simply because there will be enormous political pressure, despite the severe economic consequences, to respond to an illegal invasion similar to what we've seen in Russia. Will the war actually occur is anyone's guess. Again, a lot of things at play here, much of it related to what we do in the United States to try to contain Chinese ambitions, both from a military perspective as well as industrial capacity perspective, and two, what Taiwan does, perhaps most importantly, what Taiwan does to make invasion an impossibility. So I think we're a little bit running over, but maybe one or two questions, if there are any.
You answered the question.
Oh, you answered it? Anybody else? Thank you. There you go.
Hello. Yeah, that works. Thanks, Dmitri. If I am understanding you correctly, it sounds like, at least as you foresee it, a Chinese takeover of Taiwan would be a military takeover. And I'm curious, like, how you weigh the likelihood of that vis-a-vis essentially like a de facto change of control that comes about as a result of intense economic pressure or other types of hostile measures that are short of military conflict, and whether both can happen at once, or really this ultimately does have to culminate in some sort of kinetic conflict.
I think that's highly unlikely for several reasons. That's a good question. One, the Taiwanese have been watching what's been happening in Hong Kong very closely, and any pro-Chinese reunification movement that exists in Taiwan, and there was a legitimate movement there about the idea of one day reunifying on a sort of one country, two systems basis, has dissipated. There's no one that trusts the Chinese anymore because of what has happened in Hong Kong, because of what's happening in Xinjiang and elsewhere. So the idea that they would just reunify peacefully, I think, is a pipe dream now for the Chinese, and the Chinese are starting to appreciate that. In terms of economic pressure, that never works. If you look at even what the U.S. has done to pressure other countries vis-a-vis sanctions, even Iran, Iraq, North Korea, you name it, it just does not work. And with regards to changing the regime through covert action, look, this is exactly what the Russians have tried to do in Ukraine for many, many years, largely unsuccessfully, and the Russians are considerably better at it than the Chinese. So I think that's also highly unlikely, and particularly changing the regime in a way that would push for a reunification with China that just will not, you'll have riots in the streets. I don't think that there's any prospect of that. So I think military option is going to be their only option from here on out, unless something dramatically changes with the Chinese government on the mainland.
Okay. We've been notified we have time for one more question. So is there one question left?
So in that situation in next 10 years when Chinese militarily attack Taiwan, what should the U.S. do?
That's a great question. It's a hard question to answer because the circumstances are highly contingent, right? As I mentioned, if you have a situation where the Taiwanese don't fight and there's a rapid takeover of the island within 48 to 72 hours, there's really nothing that the U.S. could do in that situation because we're too far away from Okinawa, from Guam, and elsewhere. We just wouldn't get there in time. It would be a fait accompli. That's the hope that the Chinese are going to have for an invasion scenario. If the Taiwanese fight, I think it's almost a certainty that we would come to their aid. How exactly we come to their aid is an open question. What the rules of engagement would be, I think it would be significantly more than what we're doing in Ukraine, which is already considerable. It's arms supplies, it's being involved in operational details of their war plans, as we now know. I think we would be in the fight. Would we take that fight to the Chinese mainland is an open question. Would the Chinese take that fight to us and to our bases in the region, like Guam and Okinawa? I think it's really hard to predict how that conflict would unfold, but keeping the escalation at a certain level is going to be an intense focus, I think, of both sides. Whether they succeed in that or not is going to be very challenging. I was at an event recently with some senior Pentagon officials, and there was a question about what is the lesson that China is learning right now from Russia. And the answer from one of the officials was that they're learning that nuclear weapons are incredibly important. And what they meant by that is that the Chinese are looking at this conflict in Ukraine, and they're seeing that U.S. has certain limits in its support because of our fear of escalation going too far, and us actually triggering a potential nuclear escalation or kinetic escalation with Russia that could ultimately result in a nuclear escalation. So that's one of the lessons they may be learning, that the fact that China has nuclear weapons, that they can strike the U.S. mainland, may deter us from supporting Taiwan. I think they're mistaken in that view because our interests in Taiwan are considerably greater from a national security perspective and economic perspective than they are in Ukraine, but they may very well miscalculate. So thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. It was great to have you.